Hi, my name is Dan, and this is SLAYsmr, an ASMR channel where every week I whisper about a new horror movie that I love. This week is 1982's Creepshow. I'm really excited to talk about Creepshow because it is anthology horror, which I feel like doesn't get enough love. And to be honest, there isn't an especially high number of really good anthology horror movies. I'm sure all of you watching know what anthology horror is, but in case you don't, just a little refresher. It's essentially a movie or a TV series or what have you that instead of one unified, coherent story, it consists of many vignettes, if you will, often in the same universe, and usually with some kind of wraparound story or a host. So if you've ever seen Tales from the Crypt, you have the Crypt Keeper, right? Even though it's a bunch of different stories, you have the Crypt Keeper kind of serving as the organizing principle and unfolding all of them in his book or whatever he uses to read them from. If you've seen the movie Trick or Treat, which is another one of my favorite anthology horror movies, that's a little bit different in that it's a bunch of different stories all taking place in the same universe, and the stories do become interconnected at a certain point. The Twilight Zone would be considered anthology, but Creepshow I think is my favorite because it is the most indebted to the EC Comics aesthetic. I mean, I guess Tales from the Crypt is indebted to that because it's actually based on EC Comics stories. And by EC Comics, I of course mean all of these anthology horror comics from the golden age of comic books. So Vault of Horror, Tales from the Crypt, etc. But even though the HBO series Tales from the Crypt was actually based on some of these stories, I would argue that Creepshow, directed by Jordy Romero and by Stephen King, I would argue that Creepshow actually feels more like a comic book. When we start the film, we have the framing story, right? The kind of bookends, if you will, of the movie. And Tom Atkinson plays this horribly abusive father who is chastising his son, who's actually played by Stephen King's real-life son, Joe King, who goes by Joe Hill, who's a famous writer in his own right now. Tom Atkinson is chastising Joe Hill for reading comic books, for reading this comic book called Creepshow. And, he slaps him around and sends him to bed, and the kid kind of wishes for revenge against his dad, and then at the window, he sees the creep, who is the Creepshow host or mascot. I feel like any good horror anthology has some kind of mascot or host. You have the Crypt Keeper with Tales from the Crypt, even in Trick or Treat. Even though you don't have like a narrator per se, you do have the symbol of the film, which is the little trick-or-treating kid whose name is Tot. I found out. I won't go too much into what he is because we might have a trick-or-treat episode coming soon. Anyway, the host is this figure called the Creep, who is essentially just a really ghastly looking skeleton floating at the kid's window wearing a tattered robe. And the creep in Creepshow doesn't actually talk. What happens is at that point in the movie where the kid sees the creep, the credits transform into a cartoon, so suddenly it literally looks like a comic book come to life because we're in cartoon land. And then the way we go through the different stories in the movie is that it's flipping through the pages of a comic book, and we see these little animated interludes where the creep is making all these really bad puns about the stories we're about to see. But we never hear him talk, we just read this a little bit as text on the screen, and when the creep is live action, it's just kind of a puppet or an animatronic at the window, with special effects by the great Tom Savini. I don't know if you can see that book back there. That's actually a book about various Tom Savini movies and how he achieved the makeup effects. Quick side story about that. So I got that book because when I was in high school, I was doing high school theater competition, thespian competition. That's what we called it in Florida. And I think I was 14, and I had written this really bad play that was called The Screen, and it was a dystopian play where TV had overtaken everything, so it was kind of a rip-off of 1984, but instead of Big Brother, you worship the screen, which was this all-knowing, omniscient television screen. It was very good. It wasn't even formatted coherently, but it was the first play I wrote, so I guess that counts for something. But it didn't do very well at competition. I was kind of bummed out. And at these drama competitions, they would always have these booths of vendors selling everything from wigs to props to theater books. And my mom was with me, and she found this book and bought it for me. And it's funny because I feel like whenever I talk about how I was weaned on horror, or how I discovered it, I talk a lot about my dad, because my dad likes genre fiction and horror movies a lot more than my mom does. And so, he's the one who showed me a lot of these movies. But I also have to give my mom credit, because she was just there with me. My dad wasn't with her. And she knew that this was a book that I would gravitate toward. I don't know if she knew who Tom Savini was specifically at the time, but I think she just thumbed through it and knew that I liked a lot of these movies, and it was kind of the perfect gift. And I remember it made me feel so much better. I remember feeling really sad about seeing this, or about getting this very much deserved crappy score for this crappy play I wrote. But yeah, my mom was proud of me regardless. So that book always means a lot to me. It's from like 1998 or 9. So Tom Savini's obviously done more work since then. But yeah, it's a great, really generously sized book about his work in Creepshow and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 and Day of the Dead and all these kind of classic horror films that he designed really gnarly makeup for. So yeah, I always kind of cherish it, and that is why it is back there today. Anyway, so Tom Savini did the effects for Creepshow, and he actually has a cameo at the end as a garbage man who finds the comic the kid was forced to throw away in the trash. So Tom Savini did all these really gruesome effects that we'll talk about as we go through each story. So yeah, back to this idea of Creepshow being anthology. So already we have this framing device of a comic book, which I think separates it even from the Tales from the Crypt series. We have this animation that puts us in that style. And then once we go through the actual stories, none of the stories are cartoons, they're all live action. But there are very specific moments in each story where suddenly there will be a comic book panel border on the screen, so it will be still a live action movie, right? But it'll be kind of framed by a comic book grid. Or another trick that I love is that all 5 of these stories have what I like to call the moment of horror, to steal a Grand Guignol term. There are many scary moments in each of them, although scary is kind of maybe an inappropriate word, because I've never found Creepshow to be especially frightening. It's more fun. It's really fun and twisted. A big part of anthology horror for me is that it's just permission to get really nasty and vindictive, because we're not taking it that seriously, right? Everything's so over the top in Creepshow that you might be skeeved out a little bit when something violent happens, but I don't know if I would call the movie especially disturbing or viscerally upsetting or anything. It's more like a romp. It's a good time. But in each installment, they have the moment of horror, which is essentially the climax of each story, where someone finally sees the monster, or the monster attacks, or whatever it is. It's a very extreme moment, and George Romero does this great trick where every time that happens, we get some kind of comic graphic around it, and then the lighting is suddenly very comic booky. So it because comic books don't have as many colors as real life, right? So if someone's screaming, like in the story The Crate, it will just be red light behind them. In the Stephen King story, the one that he actually stars in, his body is being overtaken by this vegetative plant-like alien, so it's this like solid green light behind him. Every story has one of those, and I think it's a really distinct calling card. And I actually think George A. Romero's direction is so specific in this movie. I mean, it's making it look like a comic book in every sense of the word. The lighting, the panels, even the acting. I mean, the acting is kind of wonderfully over the top. Some actors more than others, but it feels like a comic book. We all know comic book dialogue is, at least in these easy comics, it's very pulpy, it's very over the top, and I think all of the actors have a really good grasp on how to deliver those kinds of lines. So yeah, directionally, I think this movie, to me, feels so much more firmly linked to the easy comics that inspired it than so many other anthology series do. Rewatching it still feels so distinct to me. The lighting actually made me think a lot of the 1990 adaptation of Dick Tracy, which is even more extreme in how it's tied to pulpy comic book pages, and that Dick Tracy purposely had a very limited color palette. I don't remember the exact number, but I think the costumes, the buildings, the lighting, everything, it's all using like 5 colors or something like that. Creepshow isn't that limited, but it's still that same aesthetic, right? This idea that we're gonna backlight everything with really solid colors. Bram Stoker's Dracula is another movie that does that. It's a very stylized choice, but I think in the right movie it pays off really well, and it certainly pays off in Creepshow. I feel like when we do a new movie on this ASMR channel, I like to talk a lot about theme and just what the movie means or what it's trying to say, or maybe how it's tied to my own life. And the fun with Creepshow is it doesn't have any of that. I don't think King and Romero are trying to change the world with this movie. I don't think they're trying to comment on anything other than how awesome anthology horror comics are. I would say if there's any kind of unified theme, maybe it's revenge or vengeance. I feel like almost every one of these stories has something to do with someone getting revenge, and it's usually nasty. And then what happens sometimes is the thing or the person getting revenge and acted upon it, then they come back for revenge at the end of it. So there's kind of this stinger to the end of each of these tales. The first one, we talked about the framing story with Stephen King's son and the great Tom Atkinson. The first story is called Father's Day. Really simple. It's about this miserable rich family. Oh, and I should say, they filmed most of the segments in or near Pittsburgh. I read that George Romero actually, I think it was like an abandoned girls' school or something, they got to use as this almost like makeshift studio backlot for a lot of the movies, with a few exceptions here and there that we'll talk about. And George Romero obviously is, I think, probably the most famous, or at least the most iconic director to come out of Pittsburgh. He's like Pittsburgh's favorite son. He always does right by that city, so I could totally see why the city would be cool giving him those kinds of resources. The Crate, which is my personal favorite story, was filmed at Carnegie Mellon University, where I think George Romero went to school. Anyway, the first story, Father's Day, takes place on this big, bountiful estate that is actually this all-girls school. And it's about this miserably rich family who they're all gathering, and they're waiting for Aunt Bedelia to come over, who is just known as being this eccentric, tortured family member. And what you find out is that before she comes to dinner with them every year on Father's Day, she stops by the nearby gravesite of her own father, who she killed with a marble ashtray for being abusive and actually having her husband murdered. I told you this is like really nasty stuff. So already we have this act of revenge, right? We have the father killing his daughter's fiance. Really nasty business. So she goes there to this gravesite to sort of figuratively piss on the grave a little bit. She's a drunk, and she pours whiskey on the grave, and of course it reanimates the father, and he comes back as this really mossy, disgusting revenant zombie. And you can guess what happens next. He kind of proceeds to dispatch everyone in the family, and the stinger at the end of this is that he wanted a Father's Day cake because he was killed on Father's Day. He never got his cake, and so he, of course, takes one of the family members' heads and makes that a cake instead. It's funny because Father's Day is actually probably my least favorite of these stories. It's not bad by any means, but it's definitely the simplest. I mean, all the stories are kind of simple in terms of what the setup is. I feel like they all have one move, right? They could all be described as, okay, this is an angry ghost story. This is the monster story. This is the icky bug story, however you want to describe it. But I think with Father's Day, there aren't a ton of surprises. I mean, within the first 5 minutes, this horrific zombie thing comes back, and he does what the horrific zombie thing should do, right? There's not the biggest reveal / surprises him entering with this severed head that's been fashioned into a cake. But I don't think that's all that different from what he would do anyway, right? There's little amount of surprise. Definitely not as much surprise as we'll see in some of these stories. That being said, the makeup is excellent. I don't know if you can see it right there. My finger is on the front of that book. I think that might be a prototype of the father's skull or the mask. In the movie, it's like caked with mud and has stringy hair and maggots crawling in it, so it looks a lot more detailed than that. So that might be from something else, but just looking at it on the screen here, it looks like it could be the father's head from Father's Day. Also, a fun bit of trivia: the new guy in the family who married into it is played by Ed Harris, and he does this really funny, goofy dance in it while they're waiting for the aunt to get there. They're kind of hanging out, and he's dancing with his fiance. And I feel like the 80s was a renaissance period for dorky dudes in their 30s, not unlike myself, doing really silly dances in horror movies. You've got Ed Harris in Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Okay, I mean, he says 20s, he's not my age, but there's a very famous dance in that they actually analyze a lot in the Scream Queen documentary on Shudder. And that dance actually had a lot more implications that we'll go into when we get into that movie. That's a whole other topic to talk about. And then in Friday the 13th, the final chapter, you have Crispin Glover doing Crispin Glover, and at a party scene is doing this really silly dance. The Crispin Glover, I kind of understand it because he's so out there anyway, but seeing Ed Harris do this is pretty funny, especially because he's the most reserved character in this particular segment. The thing about this story that I think disturbs me the most actually isn't any of the actual violence in it, but when we get this flashback to the Father's Day where the father died, his daughter's trying to make him this cake, and she's crying because he's in the other room screaming at her and being verbally abusive, and she can't focus, and she's squeezing red icing or pink icing out of, a frosting bag, whatever you call it, a piping bag. And she's getting so distraught that she just keeps squeezing it until the icing is piling up on the cake without looking like any discernible image. That is somehow more disturbing to me than any of the actual blood we see in this. It's almost like the violence is being foreshadowed or symbolized by this growing mound of really sickly looking icing. That's always what I remembered as a kid from the movie, and it's still the thing that really disturbs me. So that's Father's Day, and even though it's my least favorite of the bunch, I think it's a good way to start the film because it's simple, it's familiar. We've all seen The Ghost Who Wants Revenge, so it's not putting anyone off too much, I don't think. If you're like a non-horror fan watching this movie, they're not starting with the weirdest one, right? The weirdest one might be the second story, the next one, The Lonesome Death of Jordy Farrell, starring none other than Stephen King himself. I don't think it was his first acting role. I think his first acting role was actually another George Romero movie called Night Riders that I've never seen. But definitely his first, and really his only big starring role. I mean, he is Jordy Farrell. He's the main character in this. And The conceit of this one is that this not very intelligent farmer, Jordy Farrell, finds a meteor that's crashed into his property, and he touches it in hopes of maybe selling it for some cash, and he starts growing vegetation, moss on his fingers, and it starts spreading everywhere, and then it spreads everything he touches and kind of just starts overtaking his farm. And it's funny because the title of this one is so sad. The Lonesome Death of Jordy Farrell. That is a very tragic sounding phrase. And this one is a tragedy. But what's so interesting about it is Stephen King's acting is so over the top. I mean, he is country bumpkinning this up to the point that he, even by comic book standards, it's over the top. He seems like a cartoon character. And I think it kind of works. I feel like his performance is very polarizing. People think he's acting not human, but once again, this is an over-the-top story, so it doesn't bother me. And he's doing a lot of, like, literally sticking his tongue out and, like, scratching his head. You can almost hear the cartoon sound effects. But I think it matches the style of this particular piece, so he keeps having these fantasies about going to sell the meteor, and this college professor he tries to sell it to is really stern with him. And then that same actor plays a doctor when he imagines going to see the doctor for the stuff on his fingers, and then he actually hallucinates his own father, and it's played by the same actor. So there's really only two actors in this, Stephen King and the guy playing all these figments of his imagination, so it just puts it in a very theatrical place already. So I have friends who hate Stephen King's acting in this, but I think it really works, and it's genuinely funny. I actually think he has really good comedic timing in all this. And his over-the-topness actually does make the end a lot more sad. So the way this ends is that he realizes that his body's just going to be completely overtaken by this green moss, this alien force, and spread everywhere. So he gives himself a bath, which just makes it worse. And then in the morning, we see the green stuff growing everywhere. And then he emerges from it. He's become this almost full-on plant man who can't really function, almost like a swamp thing, but not as articulate or in shape. He looks like this out-of-it Muppet. That's the best way I can describe it. And he speaks in this really distorted voice. And he hopes for the first time in his life that he has good luck with what he's about to do next. And what he's about to do next is shoot himself. And it's actually probably the most serious movie, or serious moment in all of Creepshow. It is a lonesome death. It's this guy who probably hasn't had anything his whole life, and he sees this meteor. He thinks he's going to get something. It doesn't pan out. He gets bad luck, Farrell luck, as always. And he makes the decision to end his life. And the acting in that moment's very serious too. I mean, granted, the guy's covered in green stuff. It's not like you can see Stephen King's face or really understand his voice, but it's not played for laughs. And there's something that's so sad and jarring about that when compared to the acting and production style in the first half of the segment. It actually makes me sad and disturbs me a little bit. So I think his over-the-top acting and just the over-the-top nature of this story ends up serving it well when it gets really serious. It's a shift that really gets to you. The general plot of this actually reminded me a lot of the H.P. Lovecraft story Color Out of Space, which I just watched on Shudder, the Nicolas Cage adaptation that came out. I mean, that's a lot more disturbing, played a lot more seriously, but just this general idea of a meteor crashing on a farm and it doing things to the people and the land they inhabit. It just had shades of that to me, just the general plot. Like I said, I don't know if there's an actual connection there, although I do know King is a huge Lovecraft fan. Next, we move on to something to tide you over, which is the first proper pun that we get in Creepshow, which once again, man, horror anthology, you gotta have some really awful puns. I remember the Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt put out a whole Christmas album when I was a kid, and every song was just a typical Christmas standard, but with just an altered words and titles to make it gross. So instead of we wish you a Merry Christmas, it was we wish you'd bury the missus. So it was literally, we wish you'd bury the missus, we wish you'd bury the missus, we wish you'd bury the missus, she's been dead for 10 years, or something like that. Just awful stuff, but I kind of love it too. So yeah, the reason this one is called Something to Tide You Over is that's another revenge story on many levels, and this is what I mean about the revenge kind of getting turned on each person. Leslie Nielsen plays this rich tycoon who lives on a beach, and he finds out Ted Danson's character has been having an affair with his wife, and so he kicks off the revenge by giving them this horrific death where they're both buried up to their necks in sand as the tide rolls in, and they have to watch each other die on these TV screens. But then that gets flipped because they end up coming back as these sea ghosts, or these reanimated corpses from the sea, and they take their revenge on Leslie Nielsen. It's funny because it's not all that different from Father's Day, except for the villain is the one who does the initial killing, and then the more heroic people come back and finish him off. Whereas with Father's Day, it's kind of flipped. But it's still this idea of the angry ghost, right? But I think because of the aquatic element, it feels a lot different. It's also one of the only segments not filmed in Pittsburgh. It was actually filmed in Ocean County, New Jersey, which is where my grandparents live. They're not in this specific town, but they're nearby. And I was wondering that as I saw these big high dunes, they looked a lot like the dunes in New Jersey, so I was wondering if that was somewhere up there. I mean, Pittsburgh is not that far from New Jersey. But yeah, so even though it's a similar story of ghostly revenge, they have different physical locations, one of them being in a more pastoral countryside estate kind of thing, and this one being at the beach. And then also the hero-villain roles being flipped. And I think Tom Savini has a fun time making ghosts that have been affected by different environments. So on Father's Day, the father has been underground for 7 years. He's dry. He's crawling with all this gross, crusty, earthly stuff. Whereas in the Something to Tide You Over, they're freshly dead and they've been under the water, so the corpse hue is a lot paler. You can still make out that it's the actual actors underneath there. When they attack Leslie Nielsen at the end, he tries to shoot them, and they ooze this kind of black-green blood. So yeah, Tom Savini's having a lot of fun with the ick factor there. Something that really makes this work is Leslie Nielsen's performance. It's funny because in the Naked Gun movies, which, like a lot of people, that's where I mostly know him from, those are very specifically police parodies and slapstick comedy, and it works because Leslie Nielsen's acting style is so straightforward in those movies. He plays it like a drama, right? It's very deadpan, it's very straight-faced, which placing this straight-faced guy in these silly situations works really well. And in Creepshow, which in many ways is a comedy, but for the most part, I would call it a horror movie, right? And his acting style is a bit different here. He's actually very jocular and self-aware of his own jokes, and very much playing the funny man in this. And it's funny because in this, he's leaning into his more straightforward comic abilities, as we would define them, in a situation that's not necessarily supposed to be funny. So I was thinking about that this time around, how the unexpected acting style serves each of these movies separately. So anyway, in the end, the ghosts get their revenge, and they put Leslie Nielsen up to his neck in sand, and he just ends with shouting, "I can hold my breath for a very long time." So it's, once again, it's the stinger, right? It's the button that I think is so synonymous with EC Comics. And Father's Day, I feel like doesn't quite have that as well as Something to Tide You Over. We then move into what I think is a lot of people's favorite segment of Creepshow, including my own. It's called The Crate. And this is the one filmed at Carnegie Mellon. It's about these two professors who discover this crate from, I think, like 1849 under the stairwell in their research building. And of course, inside the crate, it has this bloodthirsty monster who hasn't eaten in several centuries and starts to make short work of the people who encounter him. And the cosmic joke of this one is that the main professor is married to a woman played by Adrienne Barbeau, who is purposely just a really horrible person and really awful to be around. And so, he ends up sicking the monster on her, which is horrible, right? I mean, he kills his wife, that's horrible, but Adrienne Barbeau does such a good job of making you hate this woman. She's having a lot of fun with the role. She's that person at the party who is just insulting everyone and not being funny and has no manners and it's not kind. And you can just see Adrienne Barbeau, I think, actually does really well in so many horror movies because she's able to blend pathos with a really good sense of humor, and you can tell she's just having a ball being this awful person, especially when Hal Holbrook plays her husband, and he's just plays the most doormat kind of droll sort of guy. I mean, I think they're both bad people. He still does a really bad thing by the end of this, which is feeding his wife to a bloodthirsty monster. I've always tried to figure out what exact creature it's supposed to be. It's a puppet that just has all these teeth, and on the set I think they nicknamed it Fluffy, which is pretty funny because there's nothing fluffy about it. It almost looks like simian or some kind of primate, and we know it's from the Arctic, right? So I don't know if it's supposed to be abominable snowman yeti type creature. It's not very big. It can fit in this crate, right? And because it's a puppet, we never really see it from the waist down. But as a kid, I think I thought it was much bigger than it's supposed to be because it just has this maw of teeth. I almost know what it looks like. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that Michael Crichton movie Congo, which is not the best film in the world, but I think Stan Winston's mutated gorillas in that movie are really cool. They're, a lot more mangy than regular gorillas. They have parts of their fur missing. They have really messed up looking faces. That's what I always thought the crate monster Fluffy looked like a little bit. I think what works so well about this story is, remember when I said Father's Day is so simple, and the crate is simple too. I mean, we find out what the gimmick of the story is pretty early on, but it escalates so nicely. Father's Day just has this kind of one move, whereas with the crate, Stephen King establishes the rotten dynamic between this couple at this party, and then we see the first kill once this custodian discovers the crate, and then we see the professor try to tell other people about the crate and they don't believe him, and one of his grad students gets killed, and then we get the fun game of him going to Hal Holbrook's house and trying to convince his friend, and then you can see the wheels in Hal Holbrook's head turning as he ends up he turns the gimmick on its head by actually using the creature to his advantage as opposed to trying to fight it or get killed by it himself. There's a little bit of a cliffhanger as he uses this creature to kill his wife and cover up all the other bodies. He shoves the crate into a quarry, but then at the end you see the creature's escaped, and maybe these two surviving characters are not as safe as they think. But yeah, I think it works on a lot of story levels in terms of escalation because King and Romero keep upping the ante with every person that gets killed. Whereas Father's Day, the gimmick is over pretty much as soon as we've discovered it. Also, too, I didn't know this until I was researching it. I've always known that Stephen King has written the screenplay for Creepshow, but I guess two of the stories, the Lonesome Death of Jody Farrell and The Crate, were based on pre-existing published Stephen King stories. Now, they have not been collected in any of his short story collections like Night Shift or Skeleton Crew or Nightmares and Dreamscapes or anything like that, but they did get published in men's magazines in the 70s, so I'm assuming the text is online somewhere. I'm going to actually look for that, I think, once I'm done recording this. I always love to see what changed between Stephen King adaptations from, the page to the screen. So, and also, I should just, a quick side note, I think The Crate is just my favorite because I love really bestial monsters. I like all kinds of horror, but I love creatures. I love Creature from Black Lagoon. I love King Kong. I love Pumpkinhead, and I love Fluffy on the crate. So I'm just a sucker for this story. The fifth and final story is called They're Creeping Up on You, another pun, and it features E.G. Marshall, who I always knew as the really grouchy father-in-law in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. He plays another kind of curmudgeonly guy in this one, but a much more horrible person. I don't think we find out really what he does, but he's a business tycoon who is just firing people left and right and just really gets off on making people's lives miserable. But he's also a germaphobe, so he has holed himself up in this fortified germ-proof apartment, which of course a blackout happens, and it actually ends up working against him because he has a panic room and all these secure areas that end up trapping him when cockroaches invade the apartment. I don't even know if there's a ton of analysis to go into. It's just really gross. Going back to this idea of comic book lighting and setting, this is a similar thing, right? Is E.G. Marshall's apartment is stark white. The background is solid almost the entire time because it's so minimalist and clean, and something you would see out of some like futuristic dystopian novel. Like, this is where the overlords would be, right? So you have this really solid minimalistic background, and so when a cockroach creeps into frame, this little brown thing, you can see it right away. And I don't get as bothered by cockroaches as some people, but I did live in Texas for a while, and now I live in Atlanta. Austin and Atlanta are cities that have a lot of cockroaches. You're kind of known for it, so it becomes relatable to me right away. Sitting in a room where you think everything is clean and you're protected, and you see this bug scurry across it. And also, with this being Creepshow, the bugs just multiply. I mean, it's disgusting. I won't describe it too much here because you're trying to fall asleep. You don't need to hear about bugs, right? But the place just gets overrun with cockroaches, to the point where he gets trapped in his panic room and gets a heart attack, and you can probably guess where the cockroaches go after that for the movie's big final effect. That movie I mentioned a couple weeks ago, In Search of Darkness, which is that mega long Shudder documentary about 80s horror. Tom Atkinson, who's the dad in Creepshow, he was on it, and he was talking about how they had so many cockroaches, and I think they just ended up releasing a lot of them into the Pennsylvania wilderness afterwards, even foreign species. So I don't know if there's some kind of invasive species of cockroach in the Pittsburgh wilderness that has become a problem thanks to Creepshow. It's funny thinking about this one too. I don't know if this is anyone's favorite segment in Creepshow because it's so gross. It's so effective too. My wife was on the couch kind of doing some work while I had this on, and she was saying how she just doesn't think Creepshow is that scary. And I was like, wait till this final segment though, I bet it will be really unnerving because she hates cockroaches. And so it was kind of satisfying to see the look on her face when this effect that I won't go too much into happens at the end. And apparently they did not have as many live cockroaches as it appears in the movie. Tom Savini said that a lot of them were just nuts and raisins, just a ton of nuts and raisins. So it looks like there's a more massive infestation of bugs than there actually is. I do wonder though, E.G. Marshall is deceased now, but I do wonder if he actually had these bugs on him. It looks like he did. He definitely picks them up at some point. And if that's the case, then that man was really game, I think, because I don't know a lot of people who would do that, maybe if they were getting paid a lot of money. Something I'm thinking of with They're Creeping Up on You and the Lonesome Death of Jordy Farrell, and honestly, even Something to Tide You Over and Father's Day. All of these segments are really small casts. I mean, and They're Creeping Up on You, it's literally you hear voices of the people on the phone. Then there's E.G. Marshall and this handyman he's talking to through the door. It's like two people. something to tide you over. It's really just the two lovers and Leslie Nielsen, and then Father's Day, it's just the family at the house. Jordy Farrell's just Stephen King, and just the guy playing all the figures in his imagination. So it's interesting because I think why Creepshow is so effective is that it feels very isolated. It gets people in situations where they're kind of cut off from the rest of the world, which is a great tactic for making effective horror, I think, not giving people many outs, right? I mean, the only segment that really has more than just a handful of people is the crate. In the beginning of the crate, we see there's a party sequence at one of the professor's homes, and at the college we see some people, but yeah, it's kind of remarkable how insular George Romero and Stephen King kept everybody. It feels like a very self-contained horror movie, and that's why I love anthologies. They can, if you can do them right. And I would argue with this, there's not a dud in the bunch. I know I kind of ragged on Father's Day a little bit, but I mean, for a horror anthology, I mean, this is like a 5 out of 5. All 5 tales and the framing device are great. And I can't say that for all anthology movies. I think it's a harder thing to pull off than people might realize, because the key is these things have to go fast and hard. They have to hit. And I've seen a lot of anthologies that get a little bit lumpy, or maybe they have 1 or 2 dud segments. I just really think you cannot have a weak spot when it comes to anthologies. Even the way we end the film is great. When Tom Savini's The Garbage Man picks up the comic book, he sees an ad that's been, or an order form that's been taken out for a voodoo doll that you can order. And so the film ends with Stephen King's son, Joe Hill, using a voodoo doll on his father to get further revenge for taking away his comic book, which is totally, I mean, it becomes like a 6th story in itself. After Creepshow, they did make a Creepshow 2, which only has 3 segments, and if I'm being honest, I really only love one of them, and that's the one that's based on Stephen King's short story The Raft, and the other 2 I can take or leave. And then apparently they made a Creepshow 3 that's supposed to be horrible. And they made a web series that I heard wasn't great. And then Shudder last year did a whole TV series. I think they're doing a season 2. And I thought it was pretty good. I think they were still trying to find the exact right formula still, but there's some really, really good episodes, including one based on the Stephen King story, Grey Matter, which I really loved, and one based on a Joe Hill story. Joe Hill, who played his son, so it's kind of a cool way for everything to come full circle. You have the kid in Creepshow, grew up and became a successful horror novelist in his own right, and now in real life, and then he gets his story adapted for this new Creepshow. Pretty cool. They also bring the creep back, which I appreciate, and it's similar. You just kind of see him between the segments. He doesn't actually say anything, he just cackles. It's interesting because in Creepshow 2, Tom Savini actually plays the creep, but he looks way different. He's not this skeleton thing. He just looks like almost like an ogre wearing workman clothes. It's and he cracks puns in these segments between the main stories, and they're animated, so it's a similar thing where the movie starts as live action, the interludes go to animation, and Tom Savini's voice, I don't know if he does the voice, but someone is voicing the character, and he's actually making puns, so it's kind of interesting, but I think I just like the silent creep a little bit better, and then we see these puns in the word bubbles of the comic books. So that is Creepshow. Easily my favorite horror anthology of all time. Like I said, 5 out of 5, 6 out of 6, because there's really 6 stories and they all slap. They are all really good. But there are a lot of other horror anthologies that I like, and we will definitely be talking about one of them as we get a little bit further into the Halloween season. Until then, thank you again for watching. Remember, like, subscribe, tell your friends, try and spread the word if this series is doing anything for you. I will see you next Monday with a brand new movie to talk about. Until then, stay safe, sleep well, avoid nightmares, except for the good ones. Alright.